The U.S. and the Holocaust. Something wrong?
Yes, please. Everything's fine.
Okay. The U.S. and the Holocaust, a brand new, sobering documentary by Ken Burns. His crew put together a fabulous piece telling the story of what the U.S. was like prior to World War II in their response to Hitler's atrocities. Let's take a look at a panel discussion with Lynn Novick and Sarah Botstein as they tell the story leading up to this wonderful PBS production by Ken Burns that airs on September 18th.
I want to introduce Lynn Novick and Sarah Botstein. They may look youthful, but in fact, they're veterans of the Civil War. They were present at the beginnings of jazz. They were there when Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig played baseball, and they went toe-to-toe and head-to-head with Papa Hemingway. So please give them a round of applause. And this film, which you've watched an excerpt from, is Sarah's debut as a director. So please give her her own round of applause. So when I heard the title, the U.S. and the Holocaust, I imagined that most of the documentary would focus on the U.S., but in fact, you spend a good amount of time dealing with the Holocaust part. And talk about that choice and the decision to, at this point, after so many documentaries on the subject, to sort of tackle that.
I'll go first. Thank you so much for having us. It's overwhelming to be here and have so many people watch it with us. We really did make this film during COVID primarily alone. So I think when we set out to tackle a subject that so many of us think that we know about and understand, and to do it through a slightly different lens, which is the American response, as we began to unpool and understand what the American response was, we felt like we actually wanted to tell the story of the Holocaust at the same time. And in telling the story of the Holocaust, even for me, I did not know the tick-tock of what happened, how many Jews had died in the Shoah by bullets, how many Jews had died before one American soldier was on the ground in Europe. It's somehow taught to us in a jumbled way that for us, I think we felt that to understand the American response, to understand and to look at the newspapers, what we knew, when we knew it, what we thought about it, that you had to really understand what was at stake overseas as well.
There is a recognizable Ken Burns style where we have Peter Coyote's mellifluous voice, Jeffrey Ward's beautiful writing, the music, the photos that are pushed in on. So I wonder, in making this documentary on this subject, was this recognizable style a hindrance, an aid, or is it just the language that you're used to speaking in and telling stories in?
Well, I think we have the same elements in all of our films. We're looking at something and we're hearing something. That's the basic idea, right? So what are we going to look at? Well, we're going to try, because it's a documentary, to use visual material that is authentic to the story. So still photographs, old home movies, or newsreel that were taken by commercial photographers. That's what we can look at that represents the past. Newspaper articles, cartoons, ephemera, drawings, that sort of thing. And then, there's cases here where there's not anything to show for a lot of the story, so we often rely on what we would call live cinematography. That's the element of bringing our camera today to the places that can help us touch the past. So the destroyed synagogues and the memorials to the Holocaust, and we also were able to film in some of the existing killing centers. We were not able to go there because of COVID. We've always gone on location for every film we've worked on. Because of circumstances, we were able we made Lemonade, which was found a remarkable Polish cinematographer, one of the great cinematographers working in Europe, and he brought his camera crew to these sites. So we see them the way you all see them on screen. But in any case, that's the DNA of what we have to work with, whether it's professionally taken photographs or amateur photographs or photographs taken by perpetrators or by people who are trying to preserve history so that to show what was done, the crimes that were committed. And then we have the voices. And I'm going into all of this only to say that this is the grammar. These are the building blocks that we have for every film. And really, every documentary filmmaker is using these same materials. If you're making a documentary, you're trying to show get to the truth, some authentic truth of the past. So in this case, it's, newspaper articles, quotes from primary sources, and the testimony of people who lived through it. So, Ken did pioneer a way of storytelling about the past using voices read by actors primarily and treating still photographs as reality. And I think that's really one of his great, pioneering contributions to this field is to treat the still photograph as if it was moving. So we add sound effects so that you hear the clip-clop of a horse or a door shutting or a dog barking or a gun firing or someone yelling. It's not all the time, but we treat it like it's real because it is real. It was real. So, and I'm sorry to go on at length, but it's an interesting question about our process because these are the same elements for every film.
Right.
And yet we hope we bring something new to each time we do it with the topic, with the kind of testimony we're able to collect, and with the sort of our approach to the subject. So we hope we get a little bit better at it, but we're still limited, hopefully, to what we have to work with, So we don't see it as a limitation, we see it as these are the tools, and we hopefully bring what we have creatively and otherwise to tell the story. And it's not just Sarah, me, and Ken, our editors, and I'm not sure, one of our editors might be here, Chase Horton, moved to LA during editing. We thought he just had a baby. We thought he might be here, but I guess maybe the baby was. Anyway, so the editors are a hugely important part of how these stories get put together.
Daniel Mendelsohn could not make it here tonight, but his book, The Lost, is an amazing act of remembrance, a reclaiming and honoring of the lives of his family members who were murdered in the Holocaust, each in individual ways that particularize the ways in which 6 million seems, as we saw, too not individualized. This excerpt we saw doesn't fully convey how much in the full documentary you chose to anchor the stories in the stories of several lives, the lives of Otto Frank and his family, Daniel Mendelsohn's family, the Hilson Roth. Tell us how you made those choices, Sarah, to anchor the film with their personal stories.
Well, I think to piggyback on what Lynn was just saying, when we tackle a subject where there were living witnesses, the first thing we do is try to figure out who might have been alive during that time to help us understand it, in addition to the scholars and writers and thinkers. So that's one of the best parts of our job, is we get to know people who lived through different times that we don't know about and have them help us understand and teach us. This was a little bit different because these were primarily children during the time that we're asking them about. So childhood memory, childhood trauma, how they remember, what they remember, why they remember it, was new for us and very moving, and felt, as we always do, grave responsibility to honor their families and their stories. Daniel Mendelsohn plays a particular role in the film because he, as you were just saying, wrote a beautiful book about finding the 6 lives of his family, finding out about them to, as you're saying, find the universe in a grain of sand, to tell one person's story to represent what is an incomprehensible number of people who died. But he also is such a philosopher and thinker and public intellectual that he can help us understand the Holocaust, the American response to it, and what happened to his family, and why his grandfather carried in his wallet till the day he died the letters that his brother had sent home, and over the course of making the film, we convinced him to take them out of a safe deposit box and let us photograph those letters. So documentary evidence is hugely important, and when it's connected to the personal stories, even more so.
And very, very effectively. Lynn?
I was just going to say, you know, that it is, as Sarah said, one of the great privileges of our work to get to know people, and it takes many years. So often, if they're elderly, they'll say, "I hope I'm, you know, still around when the film comes out." And happily, everybody that you see in the film, because this did take many years, they are still with us, and we're very grateful for that. And you know, it's asking a lot, and we're very mindful of that, especially if people have lived through unimaginably difficult, painful, wrenching, tragic experiences, to have them relive it for us with a camera on for the world, you know. And so we don't take that lightly, and we're just enormously grateful and humbled by their willingness to do that.
And as I said, it really anchors the film and makes it personal when you're watching it. So it's a great achievement on your part, both of your parts. At the core of this documentary is the question which, given our setting, I will frame in a biblical fashion: am I my brother's keeper? You discuss immigration, pseudoscience, replacement theory, nationalism, the uses of diplomacy, all of which are very much in our current debate. Is that something you realized before you went into this, or did it sort of come up as you were working on it?
Well, I think we'll probably both answer this. You know, for me, the central tension of the film, and we will talk about this a lot, are the two poems that set up the introduction. What kind of a country are we? What kind of a country were we founded on being? How were we founded? Are we a nativist, racist, white supremacist, anti-Semitic country that doesn't believe in open borders and some more complicated past? And that tension plays out, I think, in every generation in a different way. And while we were making the film, which Lynn mentioned, we started to work on this project in 2015. So our country was very different in 2015 than it is now. And while we were making the film and learning this history, watching what was happening, not just here, but in Europe and overseas, and the rise of authoritarianism and fascist regimes is a pattern we can't seem to escape.
You know, I wish it weren't so relevant.
Yeah,
honestly, we all, you know. And so when we started thinking about the project, it was really the question Sarah was saying of, you know, who's a real American? And we had talked about that a lot in our film on Prohibition, because that was a movement that really sort of represented the apogee of a kind of nativist, anti-immigrant feeling that amended the Constitution to prevent alcohol from being sold, which maybe makes no sense now, but it engages all of these same themes. And, you know, I think it was that impulse in a way, and trying to understand our response to the crisis. But as the world has evolved and what we're living through, and seeing the fragility of our own democracy in such stark relief every day, even as we've been finishing the film and having to adjust small things about how we tell this story because of how we understand the material differently because of what we're living through. It's just, that happens with every project, but this one in particular, it's been quite acute.
Yeah, and when we were talking before, Sarah, you talked about that your job is documenting the paper, the documentary of paper. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, I've been talking about the film last night, said that, you know, in some ways this film is really about paperwork. And when you're struggling to get somewhere, and we all know this today in 2022 terms, but paperwork really matters. So where's your visa? Where's your application? Do you have a passport? Do you have a country? If you have a country, is your country going to defend you? Do you have the right paper? I mean, it's just a constant. Did your paper get bombed in a consulate? Did your paper make it across the ocean? How long did it take for that paper? So, you know, it's about not just people's paper, but then the people who were pushing the paper around.
Yeah. You also make the connections about how much Hitler was inspired by the U.S., not just in its embrace of eugenics, and racial theory, but also in its treatment of the Native American population. And it's not in this clip, but I'm going to read a very frightening quote by Hitler that's in the documentary. "The immense inner strength of the United States came from the ruthless but necessary act of murdering Native people and herding the rest into cages." So in this, you really do sort of bring that out. And did that surprise you, or again, did you know it was there?
I'll speak for myself. I was very surprised by that, but I had not really deeply studied the origins of Hitler's ideology. I had not read Mein Kampf. So that's, I was not told, I understood the Nazism and Hitler and the Holocaust as much as probably more than some people, but I was not a student. So coming across this idea of what he admired about America, and also, the symbiosis between Hitler and Henry Ford and Charles Lindbergh, sort of American icons who admired the Nazis, shared their anti-Semitic racist ideology, and the sort of cross-pollination here in the 20s and 30s and into the 40s. Well, I'll say 20s and 30s. I'll probably misspeak on the 40s. I was shocked by that, even though I will say I thought I knew a fair amount about Lindbergh and Henry Ford, but seeing in the context of this film where they stood and what they championed, and they weren't alone, they were hugely popular figures in America.
Yeah. And when you watch the full film, you'll see some quotes from Lindbergh that are truly horrifying, that even if you think you know, you'll still be appalled by them. By contrast, I found that you were kinder to FDR and to Rabbi Stephen Wise than many historians have been. Talk about that choice.
I'll get this one tonight. Yeah, okay. I think the president doesn't operate in a vacuum, right? He's responsible to Congress. He's responsible to his voters. He's responsible to public opinion. And I think FDR both grew up and was part of a rarefied patrician world, as Jeff Ward beautifully writes, and we know said and traveled in circles where people were overtly, we would say now, anti-Semitic and was, on the one hand. On the other hand, he brought into his cabinet and worked closely with more Jews than any president before him, and was, constantly pummeled for being too kind to the Jews, the Jewish president, the Jewish puppet. So everybody was hard on him in a way, and I think the same for Stephen Wise. I hadn't really thought a lot about, I'm a Jewish American, I come from on my father's side, Holocaust lineage, and I hadn't thought about how was the Jewish community thinking about this during the war before, and how split it was, and how divided it was, and how famous Rabbi Wise was, how famous Charles Lindbergh was. They were up there with FDR in the paper every day. So I think we try to put the people in the time that they lived in and the ways that they were trying to get at something, not with just all of our hindsight put on them. So.
And similarly,
Can I just say one more thing? Yeah, because I think especially among Jewish Americans and the way this has been passed down to us, a sense of, pinning the full responsibility for America's failures on FDR. Deborah Lipstadt, who's a wonderful historian in the film and now the U.S. ambassador for anti-Semitism, against anti-Semitism, not for anti-Semitism. She's the ambassador on anti-Semitism. She says we were fortunate to interview her before that, she says, it's too easy to pin it on FDR. It's on all of us because of what Sarah was saying. It's a country that didn't want to welcome Jews and didn't want to welcome refugees. And he wanted to fight the war and ultimately...
Right, he's battling a humanitarian crisis and a war, right? And he's also, the country's coming out of a depression. We have an isolationist country after World War I. There's a lot going on that we do try to point out. A little
Not to
bit
say
more.
that we don't wish she had done more.
Done
We
more,
do,
right.
of course.
And
We
you
made the
give
whole
a-
film for that,
And you
you know.
give a
Right.
full discussion about the question of bombing Auschwitz, which, and give Ambassador Lipstadt the final word on that subject. But
Sometimes good
you'll
thing
have
to
to
do.
watch it to see how that comes out.
Well, the point just that we have a discussion because it is a complicated topic, yeah.
Yes, and you really do give a lot of different voices on that. Talk about the unsung hero at the Treasury Department.
Oh, John Paley, a name you guys will all know on September 20th. He's a little-known diplomat in the Treasury Department, not a diplomat, a worker in the Treasury Department who helped once we Americans and the government really knew what was happening, and we were on the ground fighting in Europe, and there was the largest population left of Jews in Hungary, our government did finally create something called the War Refugee Board to try to get people out, and many of you probably know about that, and he was integral in the creation and the goings-on of the War Refugee Board, and I think they did a beautiful interview with him for the Shoah Foundation, and we were able to get access to that interview, so you hear him talking about what they were thinking and why they did what they did.
Yeah, and I'd never heard of him, and I thought it was terrific. I mean, it was really
And,
amazing.
you know, for many people who have familiar with this story, we're familiar with Breckinridge Long, who's sort of the villain of the piece at the State Department, putting up the paper walls, making it as difficult as possible for refugees to get here. Anti-Semitism and fear of spying and espionage and fifth column, and he had a lot of reasons why his goal was to let no refugees in, period. And that's the State Department and the Treasury Department, which really shouldn't have much to do with letting refugees in, because Henry Morgenthau was the head of it and because John Paley really cared, they really made it happen as much as possible.
Yeah, and again, an unsung hero that you'll all know in September. Now, you mentioned the situation in Budapest, and you discuss in that section about the Raoul Wallenberg and other diplomats who rescued Jews, but I felt there was an omission there of the Jewish resistance, who were funded by the Joint and by Gerhard Riegner at the World Jewish Congress, and for every 100 life-saving passes that Wallenberg issued, 1,000 counterfeit ones were distributed by the Jewish Rescue. So I know you couldn't cover everything in this film, but talk about that choice.
I think you answered it yourself. We couldn't cover everything. We were fascinated by Gerhard Riegner, who was a refugee and ended up in Switzerland, a lawyer, and was part of this World Jewish Congress. And he's heroic to us in that he helped to get the word out to the West about the plan to exterminate the Jews of Europe. And he was filtering sort of reports from the Polish government in exile, and eyewitness testimony, and creating reports and trying to get them to the West. And the State Department basically just buried them. Didn't want the world to know about this because they were afraid it would cause pressure on them to let in more refugees. And he just persisted and persisted and persisted, and he's one of the unsung heroes as well.
Again, more paperwork.
Right.
Because we're trying to actually understand the telegrams. We did a live shoot where we're showing the different paper, and it took us a whole day because they're redacted, they're confidential, they're a different color. What went where when was hard to figure out, but Riegner did work very hard to get the word across.
Well, again, maybe a separate movie on the Jewish resistance, but I feel like they deserve their due. This is going to be my last question because I feel like we've imposed on you enough. In the film, it seems at moments like there's a call to action or something you are saying about, well, Deborah Lipstadt says the time to stop a genocide is before it happens. And again, I won't reveal the conclusion of this film, which is very stirring, but obviously many of the issues we're dealing with today, whether it's in Ukraine or in our own country, it seems like this film is speaking to. So talk about whether you feel there's a call to action.
For me, I think it's to be really an engaged citizen at the smallest level, your local school board, your local politics, and what's happening in your little community really matter, and it trickles up. And I think people do, we become apathetic because the problems seem so big and so overwhelming, and you don't know how to help and what to do. But I do think, and we're seeing it across the country, just literally your local school board makes a big difference. So start small and go all the way up, I would say.
Lynn?
You know, I'm not sure. I think we're living in very perilous times. It's quite frightening. And I feel that, I don't feel, I see that we're arguing about what actually happened in the past and what stories we're allowed to tell and what we're not allowed to tell and whose feelings we might hurt and who we can't talk about and what really happened. And that's been our life work, is to try to excavate the past and tell these, honest, true, sometimes difficult stories so we can know ourselves. Because it seems to me in America right now, we don't know ourselves. We have different versions of the past that are in competition. And I don't see how we move forward until we can get to some sense of shared understanding, as difficult as that would be. And really, for me, that's why I wanted to work on this film. So this is just one story, of which there are many. But the tagline that PBS came up with, a history to be reckoned with, I feel that's also our obligation as citizens, is to take an honest look at ourselves and our past and admit our faults, admit our failings, and try to move forward with that understanding.
And that concludes our sermon for tonight. Thank you to PBS, KCET, PBS SoCal. Thank you to our filmmakers, Lynn and Sarah, who really did a great job. And thank you, Wilshire Boulevard Temple. Good night.
Thank you.